hear your story. I see your courage. I listen gently with open heart. I hear your story. I see your courage. I listen gently with open heart.
You were right, that was short. So good morning, everyone. The opening words are from the person I'm going to be talking quite a bit about today, Abram X. Kendi, who is a professor and is one of the most significant young voices in the work on anti-racism. And this is what he says. The good news is that racist and anti-racist are not fixed identities. We can be a racist one minute and an anti-racist the next. What we say about race, what we do about race in each moment determines what, not who, we are. So again, welcome once again.
Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Meadville's Zoom live service. Please use the chat to enter your personal joys and sorrows during the service, and we'll summarize them later. And we also, you can also use the button on the UU Church website to donate or send your pledges directly to the church. This month's Share the Plate recipient is the Meadville Soup Kitchen. While Reverend Alex lights the chalice in the sanctuary, I invite you to light a chalice at home and join me in the chalice lighting words. This is a house of reflection and contemplation, of joy and sorrow, friendship, sharing, and laughter. We light this chalice in remembrance of what we have been and in the hope of what we may become. Also, please join me in our unison affirmation of covenant and mission. Our covenant is to be a loving, joyful community that nurtures spiritual growth, promotes compassion, social responsibility, and service in an atmosphere of mutual trust. Our mission is to be a faith community devoted to love and respect, reason, and justice. And with many thanks to the Sunny Hill UU Church in the South Hills of Pittsburgh for sharing this video with us.
I am that great and fiery
The reading this morning, again, is from Abram X. Kennedy, and this is what he says. That is what it truly means to think as an anti-racist. To think there is nothing wrong with Black people, to think that racial groups are equal. There are lazy and unwise and harmful individuals of African ancestry. There are lazy and unwise and harmful individuals of European ancestry. There are industrious and wise and harmless individuals of European ancestry. And there are industrious and wise and harmless individuals of African ancestry. But no racial group has ever had a monopoly on any type of human trait or gene. Not now, not ever. So as you listen to the homily, which will be a little bit longer today, please reflect on the following questions for conversation during the breakout rooms. When did you personally learn about racism? And what effect, if any, that have on you? So once again, good morning, everyone. Thanks to Deb for leading the service today and to Amy for all the incredible work she does for music and also helping prepare this service, and a tremendous amount of work that Kirsten does not only to prepare for the service, but also to edit it, plan for the recording afterwards. So this morning, I want to start a vital conversation about race and racism in America. And to some degree here in Meadville, although I haven't been here that long, so I do not know your longer history around race. But I will say that no matter what, it is an urgent conversation to have, not just nationally, but here. Many of us remember when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated nearly 53 years ago. All these years later, it seems as though we are far removed from the beloved community that he called for us to become. So having the Martin Luther King birthday weekend is a nice gesture, but it's only the tip of the iceberg of the work that needs to be done. The election of President Obama in 2008 made many white people believe that the worst of racism in America was over, that we could get on to something else because we were now a post-racial country. Now, as you've probably gathered, that is not the case. And it hasn't been the case. It's little wonder that Black Lives Matter have become one of the most powerful and important public voices for Black people in this country. Now, I need to say that the approach that we were using after President Obama was elected, and we were thinking, okay, this is a huge advance, which it was still premature. What the last 4 years have done is to rip the Band-Aid of our deep national wounds open yet again. We have seen the painful reality of race, at least from a white perspective, and that's a start. We do not necessarily understand racism in heart and mind from our personal lived experience as white people. We can drive down the road with little fear of being pulled over. Black neighbors of mine have told me there are very good reasons. They drive no more than the speed limit and are very careful at stop signs. My next door neighbor told me that he was pulled over 17 times in 2 years. There was seldom a good reason for it. He shrugged and said, "It's part of my life. I'm used to it." Black people are still more vulnerable to violence and death by police in this country. And by nearly every measure, Blacks are afforded less medical care, housing, and quality of life. compared to the white population. And Blacks are imprisoned at a far higher rate than others, and including white people. And I know that you all know this, so in a way I'm preaching to the choir, but it's a reminder that we are definitely not in a post-racial country. The events at the US Capitol 2 weeks ago underscore how differently those in power view protests of Blacks and whites. Compare what we saw at the insurrection at the Capitol with what happened this summer, not only in Washington, D.C., but many other cities around the country that in many ways Black Lives Matter was protesting, and almost entirely peacefully. I mentioned Black Lives Matter a few moments ago, and that's one reason that I called this service, Can You Hear Me? But really, it should be called, Can You Hear Us? Can you hear us? We white Americans struggle to understand what racism and race means. That's been true for me over much of my life, and perhaps you as well. And we have to also acknowledge that racism is not confined to the United States, Canada, North America. It's present throughout the world. So what do we want to do about it? Well, one step, which is going to happen starting at 12:30 today, not at 12:15, by the way, 12:30, I'll begin a class on how to be an anti-racist by the contemporary activist and scholar, Professor Ibram X. Kendi. And this is the book that I'm talking about. I chose this book because Professor Kendi talks about race from his own lived experience, but he goes further than that to argue that racism is not a fundamental part of human nature. It is learned. It's not in our DNA. And he goes on to say that the concept of race and racism arose around the 15th century during the European imperial and colonization era. Before that, it really didn't exist or existed under different names. Kendi then reminds us that the idea of one race being lower intelligence than another, as an example, is wrong. When I was growing up, as one example, the few times that I heard about black people, it was they're lazy. And that was one of the norms back in those days and probably today as well. That is the idea of one race not being at a level of another one. But hear the reading again. What he tries to do is do a both and rather than an either or. He says, once again, there are lazy and unwise and harmful individuals of African ancestry. There are lazy and unwise and harmful individuals of European ancestry. There are industrious and wise and harmless individuals of European ancestry. And there are industrious and wise and harmless individuals of African ancestry. But no racial group has ever had a monopoly on any type of human trait or gene. Not now, not ever. Now, as a little bit of an aside, when I read his book for the first time, he didn't delve too much into a question that I've pondered for a long time. What is the difference between tribalism and racism? Tribalism seems to be a dislike of strangers who look like us, but are different. Race is about different races having intrinsic differences. What I mentioned earlier, blacks are lazy. That's, according to some, an intrinsic difference, even though we know that is not true. I'll talk a little bit about that difference around tribalism and racism in a moment. But how do we start? How do we go from there? Well, when we have the breakout rooms a little later, you're going to ask those same two questions. When did you personally learn about racism? And what effect, if any, did that have on you? I'll start. But I want to go back to a few words about tribalism, because I constantly confuse the two of them. Most of you know that I grew up in rural Maine in the 1950s and 60s, and I was home taught until high school. The world beyond our farm seemed far, far away. Tribalism at that time was expressed in terms that we would no longer use today. Polacks for Polish people, Japs for Japanese, Wops for Italians, and many other demeaning names. In Maine, particularly, French Canadians were despised and called French Canucks. They spoke Canadian French. They were foreigners, outsiders. They weren't from New England. That was a bad thing. Religious differences were tribal as well. Catholics and Jewish people were tolerated, but kept at a distance. I recall an elderly relative telling me as a child, "Don't you ever get involved with a girl who's Catholic." And I asked, "Why?" And he said quietly, "They would try to convert you." And my answer to him wasn't the right one, because I said, "So what?" In those days, that was not a good answer. So, enough about tribalism. And by the way, Unitarian Universalists are a tribe. Methodists across the street, they're a tribe. People at Allegheny, they're a tribe, so on. But it's not the same thing as race and racism. So how did I learn about race and racism? Well, frankly, I didn't know very much at all. I never met a Black person until I worked at a nearby military facility during college, mostly cutting lawns. I believe there are about 1,100 people identifying as Black in Maine for the 1970 census. Most of them were military. There were no Blacks in my high school or small town. There were none at the university in southern Maine and Portland that I attended. The only experience that I had with racism in those days was watching Black people being beaten, abused, and killed on our very small black and white TV. We heard Dr. King on a few occasions, but many people in that time believed that he was a communist and so not worthy of any belief or speech. For me, though, it was very distant and mysterious. Why were people being beaten and treated as less than human? History classes in high school told the usual story of the Civil War being about states' rights and how brilliant the generals of the South were compared to the North. Slavery was mentioned, but mostly as an afterthought. It wasn't considered a major issue, at least when I was in high school. It was only when I went to Penn State as a graduate student in 1973 that my eyes and ears were open. That's a whole nother story. What effect did my new awareness have on me? Well, frankly, I'm still working on the answer to that question. Maybe you are too. It's not easy for me. I'd prefer to talk about almost anything else. I prefer to talk about addiction and the climate crisis, because those are two social justice issues that I'm very attached to. But I have to find the courage and curiosity to dive into the racial reckoning here in America. And I have learned, of course, that addiction and the climate crisis and so on have direct relationships with racism and also poverty in all the countries. So my new awareness is about 10%, maybe 1% of what I need to know. And that's one reason that I'm going to be doing this class starting today at 12:30 and then going on for a number of weeks using his book. So I'd like to stop here and go to our breakout rooms and look again at the two questions. When did you personally learn about racism? And what effect, if any, did that have on you? Thank you. Have a good conversation.
For joys and sorrows, there was one joy in the chat for Mark Wickenheiser's birthday. Happy birthday, Mark. And I understand you had a lovely walk on Presque Isle yesterday. So let us hold those unspoken joys and sorrows in our hearts and take a moment for silent reflection. We'll take just a few minute for silent reflection as we hold those unspoken joys in our hearts. Blessed be. As Reverend Alex extinguishes the chalice in the sanctuary, let us say together these chalice lighting words, extinguishing words. Let us make this coming year a journey forward. Love fiercely, live boldly, speak softly, listen deeply, find joy, love fiercely. Peace, amen, shalom, asha, blessed be, namaste.